Any kind of environmental crisis, whether it's caused by an act of God or big industry, can upend a community. That's especially true for the smaller, more rural towns that dot the landscape of the South. In the past century, natural and man-made environmental changes have transformed and even erased some of these places. Recently, two reporters based in the Gulf South ventured to some of these communities to hear their stories and to ensure that they aren't forgotten.
It's much more complicated than it might have seemed as this pollution happened, this decision was made by this company, or this big storm happened, and these people no longer live there. It's way more complicated than that.
I'm Anissa Khalifa. This week on The Broadside, we find out what happens to a small town when it meets a big opponent, and who fights for these communities to be preserved, or at least remembered, when the dust settles. Hey, this is Anissa. I just wanted to take a moment to let you know that we can only do what we do with your support. That allows us to bring you original reporting every week about the stories that matter to you, about our home, this fascinating place that we live in. To support the show, go to this week's episode description and click the link, or go to WUNC.org and click on the donate link in the upper right-hand corner. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the show. About a year ago, reporter Danny McArthur was traveling with some colleagues around New Orleans.
And we drove by this community, like the Diamond community that's in Norco, Louisiana.
As they passed through, something caught Danny's attention.
That was a community that got bought out by Shell. And it was like a mostly Black community. And so I started thinking about what other places in Louisiana that have also been like bought out by companies. And then I just started thinking about where other reasons places have been abandoned or are no longer like how they once were because of environmental reasons.
Danny is an environmental justice reporter for the Gulf States Newsroom. After this trip, they linked up with a colleague, Drew Hawkins. He's the health equity reporter for the Newsroom. Together, they traveled through the Gulf South, looking for towns that had been upended and sometimes wiped out entirely by environmental changes.
The idea was looking at an individual town from each state in our region and exploring what it was that drove that town essentially to extinction. So in each instance, it's going to be a different question that we're trying to answer, specifically looking at the individual differences between them.
Their series profiled 3 towns in the Gulf South, one each in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. It started in Easonville, Alabama. Back in the 1960s, the town was washed away by intentional flooding after Alabama Power built a hydroelectric dam nearby. Here's Danny.
Easonville was a small farming town. You know, it was pretty white. It was not like super rich by any means. You know, there were some nice houses and there were some not so nice houses. But it was also like a classic, like small community type of thing where you could be a kid and you could roam the whole community and your parents would have no idea where you were. But, you know, they trusted that you're going to be safe.
So today, Easonville looks a lot different than it did in the mid-1900s because the dam that they built forced so many people out. How has the construction of this dam shaped Easonville and the surrounding area?
Well, it drowned Easonville out. I guess what's interesting about it is because it led to like Logan Martin Lake. And the lake itself is actually now like a big tourist attraction. So it's added to the community. And the interesting thing was when I was doing research for this was how many articles would be talking about Easonville and what happened. But then they were like, but this is the cost of progress. It's so bad that this happened, but look at what we got in return. I just thought it was interesting. Do we have to sacrifice communities in order to advance? Are those two things in conflict?
Yeah, and you spoke with somebody who grew up in Easonville and still lives there today, Mike Wadsworth. What did Mike tell you about his memories of Easonville and the impact that the dam had on his community?
He explicitly remembers a man who was crying because he didn't think he was going to get enough money to be able to afford to move. And so that, to me, really illustrates just how much choice, was behind this. People kind of were taking what they could get. It's almost like Alabama Power was getting this land for like bargain prices. And it's like, not really like a bargain. It's more, that's what these people have to take.
They literally just pushed up tens of thousands of trees and burned them. And it was just like Hades at night, just fire everywhere. It was sad. You'd go by these old home places that old relatives had lived in, and the house would be there one day, and the next day it would just be in ashes.
How is it that these big industry giants could come in and make these towns unlivable to the point that residents have to leave? Like, what allows these companies to do this? How does that work?
Something like Eastonville, what we found was during that period of time, there were less environmental protections around for like communities to have input. And so it was like you had a lot less resources to fight back in the first place. And it also was a time where it was a lot easier to just decide as a company you were going to build a dam. Around the time of me doing this reporting, there was another community, Chandler Mountain, where they were fighting almost a similar fight. Alabama Power was talking about having a hydropower plan where they were. It was going to displace hundreds of homes. But the difference here was that this community did actively fight back and have a say. And Alabama Power did actually back off of the project.
Yeah. And then you have Reveal Town in Louisiana. Drew, this was the second place you profiled for the series. What happened there?
In Reveal Town, this was a community that was founded by formerly enslaved people. And this big gargantuan company called Georgia Pacific that operated railroads across the country, they came into town and they were part of things like the war effort. So they had all this national money coming in. But interestingly, they also didn't employ any local people from Reveal Town. So I think in that instance, you're looking at just pure racism. They were able to get away with so much simply because the community that was next door was predominantly, if not entirely, a small Black community.
Let's talk more about Reveal Town and the third place y'all visited after a quick break.
AI chatbots parse information. But have you ever considered their romantic potential? In a new 3-part series on love and AI from Embodied, we'll explore the intricacies of human-bot relationships, learn about the past, present, and future of sex robots, and meet people uploading conversations with their loved ones into software in hopes that it can help them grieve. New episodes drop each Friday in February, starting on the 9th. Subscribe and follow Embodied so you don't miss it.
North Carolina has more than 500 towns and cities, each with its own character, challenges, and stories to tell.
Change is difficult, and we're going through a tremendous amount of change.
I'm Colin Campbell, Capitol Bureau Chief at WUNC Radio. Join me as I travel the state of North Carolina to hear from people trying to make their communities better. The project is Main Street NC, and you can listen on the WUNC Politics podcast.
We're back with the broadside. Next, let's talk about Reveal Town, Louisiana. Drew, I know you spent some time talking with residents about a cemetery there. Can you tell us more about this?
Reveal Town is in Plaquemine, Louisiana, about 20 miles outside Baton Rouge, the state capital. And it no longer exists. It really is a true ghost town now. All that's left today is a cemetery called the Reveal Town Cemetery. So in the early 90s, the EPA came in through efforts that were really pioneered by a legendary environmental justice icon named Janice Dickerson, who was actually from Reveal Town. So this is one of her first investigations, one of her first projects in the environmental justice space. And they found that they were being exposed to toxic levels in the air, the water, and the soil, basically on all fronts. A judge ruled that the chemical company, they had to pay to relocate people. So no one lives there today because it's too toxic and too dangerous.
And so what was happening is, because a lot of people grew gardens, but plants started to die, grass started to die. And so the water would turn different colors.
So what's left now, all that remains, is the cemetery. But the residents from there and their descendants are still in an active legal battle for control of the cemetery because the chemical company that's literally right next door, it's not hyperbole, it is up against the fence, there is a massive chemical plant, is saying that they control and that they own the land that the cemetery is on. So even to access the cemetery, like for example, when we went out there, when Danny and I went out there, we went with Marla Dickerson, the daughter of Janice Dickerson, and just to get to the cemetery, we have to call the Westlake Company so that they can open an automatic gate to allow us to get access to the property.
Basically not understanding exactly what this whole compound was doing to the environment and exactly what it was doing to us being that close to it. My mama started to do some research, and eventually a suit was filed. And so from that suit, we were relocated.
You know, today what's happening is the descendants and the family members whose loved ones are buried there are still actively trying to settle control to be able to visit their loved ones and so that they can rest in peace.
And you said in your story that the cemetery isn't just a place where people are buried, it's an active place full of life. But obviously, if you have all these barriers, you're not going to be able to go there and do, the traditions that you want to do with your loved ones. When you spoke with Marla Dickerson, what did she tell you about the importance of the place and what it means to her and her family?
Well, Anissa, you hit it right on the head. I know that in the South broadly, and definitely in Louisiana specifically, cemeteries aren't just resting places. They're also places that people visit their loved ones. They'll go to spend time. And for Marla Dickerson, it was no different. And for her family, it was no different.
It was something that we did all the time with my grandmother. She liked to walk.
She talked about a story that her grandmother told her that when they would walk past the cemetery on their way to and from school, her grandmother and I guess that would be her great uncle, her grandmother's brother, would stop at the cemetery to kind of take shelter from the racism they would experience.
Because he didn't want to have to deal with everything that was going on. So we would have walks, and we would come here and we would just sit down, and she would point out where all the family members were buried. So it wasn't ever a sad occasion. It was just something that we did to celebrate our family. So, excuse me.
So for her, it's a major part of her life. It's a very big location in her family. And to be denied access to that and to make it difficult to visit your loved ones is more than just an inconvenience. It's really a personal affront, it feels like to her.
One of the things that stands out in your story is the juxtaposition of how the chemical plant and the community have claimed ownership over this space, whereas the community is claiming ownership through tending the space, cutting the grass, their emotional connection. And then you have the chemical plant, which has put a fence around it and restricted access. What does this tell us about how the idea of property ownership has changed over the last century as industry has moved into these rural areas that were once really overlooked and undervalued?
I don't know if I could come up with a metaphor that's better than the actual thing that exists, right? Where this company puts a fence around it so they own it. But the people whose loved ones are buried there that tend to the land, that take care of it, are struggling to have access to it, right? I think it says so much about just the history of Black land theft in the country as well, in addition to Black cemetery erasure, which unfortunately is not something that's unique to this story or the region or the country. So I think that those two juxtaposing images and philosophies speak to the larger discussion that has been going on in this country since it was founded, where the people who care for the land and take care of it and tend to it have it taken from them by people who put up fences and say that they own it, even if it doesn't necessarily have any quote-unquote intrinsic value to them. That little patch of land, it's not sitting on some massive oil reserve beneath it. It's not blocking a potential pipeline that would mean millions of dollars for this company, which is an international company worth billions. It's essentially useless to them. In the story, I call it a patch of grass and bones. That's really what it is. It only means something to the people who care for it and the people whose loved ones are buried there.
It's a connection. They're not here in the physical sense anymore, but their bodies are here. And while I can feel them spiritually, my soul can connect to them wherever, but here, I like to come here because they are here. They are here, and I want to make sure that they're always going to be safe, and we can always come here.
Danny, the last place that y'all covered was Claremont Harbor in Mississippi, which is an unincorporated town, and you wanted to explore whether or not Claremont Harbor should be considered a ghost town. First of all, how do you define a ghost town?
Yeah, that was the interesting question, because for me going in, when I was reading about Claremont Harbor, it was like other people who were saying Claremont Harbor is a ghost town. Some of the stores that used to be there aren't there anymore because they all got destroyed in Hurricane Katrina. But if you go to the people who lived there, people rebuilt, like people came back. And so it looked like a ghost town on paper, but then going there, it was like, no, there's still a community here.
You spoke to Jimmy McGuire, who's lived in Claremont Harbor for decades and seen lots of storms come through. What has he experienced while living in the town?
Yeah. So to him, Claremont Harbor is one of the most beautiful places in the world. He was pretty much a brand new resident to Claremont Harbor. I think he moved in April, and then by August, that's when you have Hurricane Katrina. So he had just started his life in Claremont Harbor, really.
Katrina came along and just totally destroyed my home, my brand new home. And I still hadn't hung things up on the wall, and it was just a tragedy.
He doesn't really remember a ton of what Claremont Harbor was like, before Katrina. He was one of those people who chose to rebuild. He chose to come back to Claremont Harbor and, build a new home and start over. And so he's watched the act of it growing back. And for him, he thinks Claremont Harbor is a growing community. He's like, there are houses coming up all the time, people moving in. And then me and Drew, we went to Harold and Lillian's, which is a bar that's been in Claremont Harbor for over 70 years. And so for them, it's home. This is where generations of families have lived. And so you don't want to just leave that kind of legacy behind. But then I try to think about the perspective of maybe former residents like Florence Jordan, who she doesn't think Claremont Harbor is the same. For her, she grew up in Claremont Harbor. She actually lived there until Hurricane Camille happened in 1969.
So we were all in the room, and we jumped. We said, "What is that?" So we run out of the room and telling Daddy, "There's water in the house," and they in there trying to put rags and stuff, towels and stuff at the door to keep the water out, and it's just coming in.
She actually was glad to leave Claremont Harbor. One thing about Claremont Harbor is it's a pretty white area. She was one of the few Black people who lived in Claremont Harbor. And so for her, it was literally feeling less lonely leaving.
Yeah. So what were your biggest takeaways after doing this series? What surprised you or will stick with you about this now that you've done this story?
For me, what was really the most surprising was just the passion of the people that lived in these places. So when Danny and I went to Revealtown, we met with Marla Dickerson, and we saw how important this is to her and how important being able to visit their loved ones at this cemetery really, really is to them. It's not something that's just trivial or passing. It's not ancient history to them. This is very, very real right now. And in Claremont Harbor, Danny mentioned going to Harold and Lillian's, this small bar that has managed to survive for 50 years, talking massive storms. And there's this really great line that the bartender told us that the first places that open are the churches and the bars because you need to say a prayer and you need a drink after the storms. And when we went out there and we point blank asked people at Harold and Lillian's, is Claremont Harbor a ghost town? Then there was a resounding, I don't know if the language is appropriate for a podcast, but it was definitely no. And it is very much a real place to everyone that's still there. So for me, the most surprising thing was just the passionate energy that still exists in these places, even if they're not on a map or even if they're not formally recognized as municipalities or actual cities. The people that live there are very much alive and well, and it still is very real to them.
For me, just how much these instances weren't one-offs. like these themes that we were dealing with, where they were chosen for very specific reasons. It's because these are issues that are very prominent in our region, like being displaced by industry, or Claremont Harbor, like just having to deal with natural disaster, and are you going to bounce back? And so for me, it was very interesting to think of these as illustrations of the problems and the issues that our region has to deal with and grapple with going forward, and how are we going to respond?
Thank you both so much for joining me. This was wonderful.
Thanks for having us, Anissa.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
You can check out Danny and Drew's series Place Erased at the link in the description. This episode was produced by Charlie Shelton Ormond. Our editor is Jared Walker. Sean Rue and Al Wodarski provided audio engineering support. The Broadside is a production of North Carolina Public Radio WUNC. You can email us at broadside@wunc.org. If you enjoyed the show, leave us a rating, a review, or tell a friend to tell a friend. I'm Anissa Khalifa. Thanks for listening, y'all. We'll be back next week.